Welcome to today's Corporate Venturing Insider series. Today is going to be so special. We have Ilya Strebulaev, who was my professor at Stanford and gave me all the important tips on how to design TDK ventures. Ilya, welcome.
Thank you for having me here, Nicolas. Well, I gave you some of the tips, not all the tips, okay? You always need to come back to your professor.
Many important tips, and we kept in touch, and since you teach me about corporate venturing, you even wrote a book. But before we get to that book, which is truly amazing, and I thought it was for venture capitals, but actually it's for big corporations to think like venture capitalists. Let's start with, why did you get interested by corporate venturing in the first place?
Well, first of all, I came to Stanford 20 years ago, and I came as a professor of finance. Now, what do professors of finance teach? They teach finance. So, like all young assistant professor of finance at Stanford, I would teach basic finance, okay? And then I had students who would take my corporate finance class, and then they would go out and become investment bankers, then become chief finance officers, that became managers at large companies, and they would follow finance principles that I imbued in them. And then I noticed that there are some students who would become founders, or would become venture capitalists, like institutional venture capitalists, and they would violate every single principle I gave them. And of course, I thought that they all must be absolutely wrong. So let me find out why they're wrong and how can I right them. And so that's why I became interested in venture capital, and I quickly realized that venture capitalists make decisions differently. But I was not really either intrigued or in fact knew much about corporate venture. And again, that was about 15 years ago, okay? But then several of the people whom I met in the VC industry told me, you should go to a conference, and I think at the time it was also known as GVC, Global Venture Corporate Symposium, I think it was known back then. And specifically, there was one person there whom I met at the National Venture Capital Association, NVCA, where I presented one of my early papers about the importance of venture capital, Claudia van Mans. At the time, she was the head of IBM Ventures, and she told me, you know what, Ilya, you have to go because you don't see the entire venture world if you don't meet corporate venture. And frankly, maybe she was, at the time, the only person I had ever met who was not ashamed to acknowledge she was a corporate venture capitalist. Okay. So I went to that, and back then, it was in a relatively small place. It was in Sonoma, not in Monterey like it is now. There were not so many people. But you know, being a researcher, I was interested in the gamut of experiences. And so I spent the entire conference talking to people who represented various corporate ventures. And so here is what struck me right away, was that I spent already at the time a couple of years learning about institutional venture capital, okay? Mm-hmm. And of course, institutional venture capitalists all say they're very different from each other. And there are many differences. But then when you talk to two corporate venture people from two different CVC funds, they're so different that in comparison, all those institutional VCs are very, very alike. Mm-hmm. And that piqued my curiosity for the first time. Now, and then something else happened, which is really interesting, which is my colleagues and I did, at the time, the largest ever survey of venture capitalists. So we did the survey of institutional and corporate venture capitalists. So we had at Stanford the database of every single active venture capital firm, at least in the US, both institutional and corporate. And we did the survey. We asked a lot of questions. I think it was 85 plus questions. The response rate was amazing. You know, typically you'll get like 5% survey response, and that would be considered okay or fantastic. We got 25+% response rate, okay? But what transpired is that while our survey was amazingly successful in studying how institutional venture capitalists make decisions, how they're structured, how they're compensated, and so on and so forth, our survey on CVCs, frankly, was a failure. Why? Because two different CVCs, you know, they even don't use the same terminology, and they understood questions that were asked differently, okay? And that really increased my appetite for learning more about CVCs. And then what we did with my team at Stanford is we decided, you know what, we need to go and talk to corporate VCs. And so my real investigation of corporate VCs started when we identified every single corporate VC fund of S&P 500, of course, at the time, right? And we contacted all of them. And I believe every single one of them but two agreed to talk to us. And so we conducted in-depth, lengthy interviews. And the advantage of the interview is that, of course, you know, like a researcher, you had prepared all the questions, and then later on we would code all the answers and so on, and we collected a lot of information about the parent companies, CVCs. The advantage of the interview is that you can adjust. You look into the eyes of the person, okay, and say, oh, Nicolas doesn't really understand my question, or the way he's answering my question suggests that he meant something else, and so you can adjust. It also was costly, time expensive, because that also meant that, you know, it was very difficult to delegate this to research assistants. But as a result of that, I think came that first insight paper, which is organizational structure and design of corporate VCs. And so that was really the first in-depth look ever, I think, at gamut of questions about corporate VCs. And since then, I've done a lot more research on corporate VCs, but that is the way my path took me.
So maybe let's start at that time. When you did that first survey, what surprised you the most?
Okay. So I already knew that, you know, CVCs are very different from each other, and of course research suggested that. So what surprised me is that I realized that the way corporate VCs were designed likely would not position most of them for success. And while I expected this to be 20-30%, that was way more than 50%. In fact, the majority of corporate VC units, in my opinion, should not be successful, based on what I've seen, okay? Independent of what they were telling me. And by the way, many of them also were unhappy in telling me about their problems. And in fact, even though, of course, our research was confidential, so that we would never reveal what every single our individual interview said, it wasn't anonymous. So therefore, I could follow the path of every single person in that CVC. So we collected data on every single investment professional. So it's hundreds and hundreds of them, and on every single CVC. Okay? And I wrote down in my prediction book, which I keep for all my research projects. Okay? So when you try to forecast the future, is that many of these CVCs will not exist soon. And indeed, jumping ahead, you know, 3 years later, 32% of them no longer with us. It's 3 years later, okay? And 5 years later, way more. And so, and I think even some of those who are still with us are kind of zombies. So that is, I think, was a big surprise. One of the big surprises.
So when we met in 2018, I remember you started, so the week before we had Jasper Sorensen talking about CVCs, why we should do it. And I remember you asking the class, do you know about CVCs? And we were all proud, we just learned about it. So you say, yes. And then you say, it nearly always never works, which was basically the summary of that survey.
Yes. So, you know, the CVC almost never works. But what is really amazing, and that was the second surprise, okay? So the other side of the coin is that, in fact, that survey and subsequent research showcased quite clearly that if you design the CVC correctly, not only it should work, but it would. And I think that is a very important statement, is that there are so many different ways to design this CVC unit incorrectly that unfortunately it doesn't work very often. By the way, you know, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to understand how to design corporate venture unit appropriately. Sometimes maybe as a senior executive in a company you should be brave, because some of the decisions you'll make in designing the CVC unit might be unpopular with the rest of the organization, with the rest of the management. And by the way, there is no one single way to design CVC unit correctly. Okay, so therefore, you know, I'm talking to many CEOs of companies. I advise many many leaders of large organizations, and the typical question I will say, so how should we design our CVC unit? Okay. And I say, I cannot answer this question. Now, I can tell you how you should not design. And by the way, if you remember, I had a checklist, like what you should not do. But what you should do, okay, is in fact, it's not more complicated, it just depends.
Yeah.
However, let me tell you right away, okay, there's one thing about what you should do which is critical, independent of what you do. You have to be consistent. Because it's not that there are check marks, it's not that you have to do this and that. All these decisions that you have to make, they are in fact related to each other. So for example, let's say, okay, we know that some CVCs are more strategic than financial, some CVCs are more financial than strategic, and we can talk about pluses and minuses. But the point is that if you, Nicolas, is designing a more strategic CVC unit with specific strategic mandate, okay, once you decide on this, there's a path. And so in fact, you more or less automatically answered some of the other questions of design. And when you see a strategic unit with some financial check marks, it just doesn't work. Or you say, no, we actually care about financial returns. Oh, really? And then there's a lot of kind of stuff that you should not expect in a financially motivated corporate venture unit. So consistency is key. So avoid certain things. There's a check mark of what to avoid, or ideally avoid, and then there's consistency.
And I think part of the key element of your course was about start with a strategy and then make your decision, and your design choices comes from that. But let's talk about the hygiene part, which is what not to do. What would be the things that was true when you started the survey and today? What are the things that have not changed you should not do because that would not lead to a successful CVC?
So, but let's think a little bit about this, okay? So what you definitely should not do. First is that, and this is maybe more, not for CVC leaders, this is more for their parents, okay? First is that you need to know that venture requires patience. So if you are very excited about the world of venture now, and who isn't, okay? But you design however you design your CVC, if you're my head of CVC, okay, and I say, Nicolas, I love you. Oh, by the way, in a quarter, can you please report all the metrics? Okay, so one thing that obviously corporate parents need to know is the J curve, which is in fact your lemons ripen much faster than your peaches. But even beyond the J curve, it just takes time. And it takes typically a longer time than your traditional standard corporate projects in whatever industry you are. So I think this impatience is something that I observe a lot.
Can you say what takes time? How many years would you say just for the CEO to have a sense for it?
Yeah. So, well, let's look at successful companies, okay? And my team and I have been following every single unicorn, which is a company with a post-money valuation or reported valuation of $1 billion and above. And while not all unicorns are successful, think about Theranos, okay? There was a unicorn. In fact, there's an extremely high degree of correlation between successful VC-backed companies and being a unicorn. So look at every single unicorn. So on average, it takes 6 to 7 to 8 years to exit after you become a unicorn. Now, if you invest in an early stage, Series A, it takes also 4 to 5 years to become a unicorn. So it actually might take, on average, like 8 to 9 years. Now, sometimes it takes much faster, okay? So right now, everybody's talking about generative AI, and sometimes it takes much faster. Sometimes it takes much longer. We have unicorns that are very successful companies. In my unicorn sample in the United States, that took 20 years before they exited, okay? So that it requires patience. By the way, from the strategic point of view, it does not mean that you need to wait for 20 years or for 10 years. Tangible, strategic stuff, KPIs can come before. But don't expect, as a rule, if a corporation expects a return, either strategic or financial, within 3 years, I would not start a CVC. So this would be my number one check, okay?
Yep.
And again, this is my experience that I think corporate leaders just don't really understand. So they don't really have the venture mindset. In fact, this was one of the results of that survey that we later confirmed when we expanded the survey, is that I believe something like 65 to 75% of corporate parents do not really have the venture mindset. They just did not understand, okay? So second is that, look, the venture business is quite competitive. It's particularly competitive in good times, but it's really competitive always. as a result of this, there is an adverse selection, which means that if you offer bad terms, you likely will get bad companies. Now, and the word term is also important, because at the end of the day, it's not about valuation that you offer. Now, valuation is, of course, very important, but it's about additional terms. Let me give you an example. So I think now in 2024, it's a little bit better. But back then, when we did our first survey, too many CVCs said, we insist on right of first refusal, okay? Or at the very least on right of first notice. And that is a non-standard that obviously institutional VCs don't really care about. That it doesn't mean that you will not be able to invest your money. It means that the best companies that have a lot of offers, by the way, from other CVCs as well, are very unlikely. So you would like to pick companies that also pick you, okay? And that is kind of difficult to get into. And for this, you need to offer standard terms, and you need to offer what kind of my value proposition to those companies. Because very often the value proposition is outside the terms. It's outside the valuation. And by the way, again, if you design CVC correctly, I think every single company, whether in the US, whether outside the US, if it's a large company, it can offer, in fact, a lot of value proposition. And just very often, leaders of those companies don't ask themselves this question. What can we offer small startups? And very often when they go through this exercise, oh, wow, we actually have a lot to offer.
Yep. So patience and making sure that you bring value, and you're not the one asking for special terms, which, by the way, it's not just the entrepreneurs who don't like it, but also investors in the same round who don't like it. What we did, number 3, the one thing that was bad then and still bad now.
So the reporting structure. And again, I can go from 4 to 20, but number 3, I would say the reporting structure, which is, and that depends on the specific company, specific structure, specific organizational design of the parent company. But typically, if the CVC is reported to the people who, at the end of the day, are not interested in strategic mandate or have different incentives, for whatever reason, the CVC is just less likely to be successful. For example, so let's say the CVC is reporting to Chief Finance Officer. Well, Chief Finance Officer of any large company, at the end of the day, is in charge of making sure that the company is not losing money, especially if it's a public company on a quarterly basis. And so reporting to the CFO is not the best decision.
And they don't like surprises.
And they don't like surprises. By the way, they might not like positive surprises as well. Okay. Now, reporting to the head of R&D also might not be a good idea, because at the end of the day, when you invest outside the company and bring fresh ideas, that means that sometimes those ideas may compete, or those ideas may compete not just maybe with internal projects, but bring a different perspective. Okay, and internal people can say, well, we don't like this perspective. Now, we don't know who is right, who is wrong, and by the way, internal people might be smarter, better educated, better experienced, but they're in the legacy business very often, okay? And so, therefore, there's really underlying conflict of interest that is happening in this environment. So as a result of this, I would say if the CVC is reporting to or under head of R&D is not a good idea. Now, what could be good ideas? And again, there's no one perfect solution. Well, I guess the CEO or the chairman or the board of directors would be best. The chief strategy officer, I think, is also a good idea. Okay, maybe chief innovation officer that some companies have. But you see, this is, again, you have to think through how you position CVC within your larger organization. And at the end of the day, for the CEO specifically, for the board, it all starts, why do we need CVC at all? And by the way, it's not about just strategic versus financial. In strategic, I would say, what is important to ask, so do we need CVC to help our existing businesses? Maybe by making some adjacent investments, or by discovering some, exploring some adjacent fields, or maybe in fact in the core of our expertise. Or we need to leverage whatever we already have to build something completely new. Okay? Maybe because we're concerned about our core.
Yep.
Maybe because in fact our talent, our human talent, our IP can allow us to expand way beyond our core, but we don't know how to do it. Okay. So again, you have to think very carefully through those issues. So when I work with, I often work with the leaders of large companies. Okay. And very often that is the very first question I ask. Let me give you, I will not name a company, but let me give you an example. So I worked with a very large international company, and there was kind of a workshop on corporate innovation and CVC design. And what I started by, there was 11 people in the room, I think, okay? And what I started by is I just said, look, you all invited me because you're kind of designing CVC right now. Okay, so everybody, let's spend 3 minutes. Write down just one sentence. What do you think is the strategic mandate of that corporate venture unit, but just in detail, okay? There were 11 completely different answers.
Yeah, then you have a lot of work to do.
You have a lot of work to do. First on exploring what actually you need from a CVC, and then reconcile the differences.
So we talked about all the things, only 3 of the things not to do. When you were doing your first survey, you talked about your betting book where you could predict who was going to fail. Did you also look at who you thought were going to be successful and proved to be successful? And can you think about what made you think they were going to be successful?
Yeah. So first of all, there are different degrees of success, or different ways to measure success.
Well, surviving first.
Surviving first. And again, being an outsider, in fact, it's easy to measure financial returns. It's much more difficult to measure strategic returns, especially being an outsider. And also because, if we look at TDK Ventures or we look at any other corporate VC, they have different strategic objectives. How can I compare? Financial returns, I can compare you. Metric of success is survival. And survival not just in terms of years, even though it is a good metric, but surviving the change of the CEO. Because in fact, many CVCs disappear when the new CEO comes in and says, what is that? That was the toy of the previous CEO, right? And it happens, and it happens too often, okay, for everybody's companies.
It was one of your slides at Stanford, I remember it.
Good, okay, you have good memory. You're a good student. So what was the factors that I thought that CVC definitely would survive?
Yes.
Okay, and then I will tell you whether it's actually the case, because now 5, 6, 7 years later, we can look at the results. So first is that the CVC design did not have egregious errors, kind of, okay? Second is that the way CVC worked, the personnel that CVC had was, I think, well positioned.
Okay.
And here's something important, and again, there is no one correct solution, but I would say the best CVC structure that you can have is to have both people in your CVC, and I meant investment professionals, not operating professionals, who have an experience with the parent company. So they come from the parent company, they have experience, they know their way around, even if they don't have a lot of venture experience. And at the same time, you have people who are outside your parent company, people who worked in other CVCs, or maybe more likely worked in institutional VCs. Okay. By the way, amazingly now, they don't need to be exactly in your area. Now, if you're a biotech CVC, you don't want somebody from consumer side or fintech, obviously, but it does not need to be really that.
It can be
narrow.
adjacent.
It can be adjacent. It can be broadly. Like for example, very often tech is very broadly understood. Okay. So ideally, you have a mixture. And that is because CVC is in a very kind of unusual and sometimes uncomfortable position. So it effectively has to sell itself to the parent company. And not just to the parent company, but to the parent company people.
Which could be many stakeholders.
Which could be too many stakeholders, right? And by the way, the CVC does not know any stakeholders. That's kind of problematic. On the other hand, you have to sell yourself to other VCs, to startups. You need to have a flavor on the market. You need to be able to get into deals and so on and so forth. And if you're coming from inside your company and you don't have any experience, you don't know the markets, it's difficult. By the way, it's not impossible, just will take time. and you don't have that much time. So that is a factor I looked at. And so when we look years later, I already mentioned that too many CVCs became unsuccessful, so we used various measures of success. And those factors were important in predicting which CVC is more likely to survive, which CVC is more likely to have a good financial return, and to the extent that we can measure, we don't measure this very well, I think, to the extent that CVC realized strategic goals. So M12 was started in 2016 by the guy who was asked by Microsoft CEO to design M12. So the guy is Nagraj Kashyap, and before that he was heading another CVC, Qualcomm Ventures. Okay. And so this is, by the way, an interesting example, which is, Qualcomm and Microsoft, of course, are technology companies, but you would not put Microsoft and Qualcomm in the same industry bucket, right? One is kind of software, traditionally. Another one is cheap semiconductor technology, hardware.
Yeah, and one was more computing, computers,
right.
And
so
mobile.
So it's different, okay? And yet Nagraj Kashyap from Qualcomm came and designed M12. And the way he designed, well, first of all, he was given some freedom to design, okay? And then the way he designed M12, I think, positioned M12 for success. And now, I think, under the new head of M12, Michel Gonzalez, I think this trend continues. Now, let me give you an example. And by the way, that is a very important example, both for CVCs and institutional VCs. Okay? And this is how you make decisions. And by the way, in my book, we talk a lot about that. Yep. We have a special chapter on this called Agree to Disagree. And I feel that, in fact, it's truly very important. So, first of all, let me explain what this is and then why it's important.
Thank you.
And then I'll come back to M12. So most VCs, whether CVCs or institutional VCs, they make decisions in groups, in partnerships or investment committees. So there's more than one person involved. It could be 3, it could be 20, okay? So most of the time it's like 5, 6, 7 people for institutional VCs. And in fact, sometimes there's a 2-layer decision for corporate VCs, okay? But even in the second layer, like 10, 11 people. Now, both for CVCs and for institutional VCs, either in the majority of cases for CVCs or almost in the majority, you require consensus. Now, most VCs, whether they are corporate VCs or institutional VCs, they make decisions in groups, in partnerships, in investment committees. Now, for the institutional VCs, it's mostly like 6, 7 people, but it could be between 3 and 12. For corporate VCs, there is very often the 2-layer structure, but at the second layer, the parent level investment committees would be maybe 10 people, let's say, between 7 and 15, okay? Now, in the majority of cases, well, in the majority for corporate VCs, in almost majority for institutional VCs, the decisions are made by consensus or unanimity, okay? Now, but let's talk about consensus. What does consensus mean? Well, it means that, let's say, consider a simple example. Let's say there are 7 people around the table. They're all investment partners, okay? And we consider a kind of a deal. Consensus means that, well, kind of, some of us must be extremely enthusiastic about the deal. Otherwise, of course, we will never invest. But nobody can be against. If at least one person says, guys, this is truly outstandingly stupid deal, consensus means that we will not invest in this deal, okay? And by the way, when we think about traditional world, very often it's the right structure. When the decisions you make about projects where there is no uncertainty, or there is noise, but there's almost no big uncertainty, okay? Like incremental innovation, for example, or building something that you already built many, many times. I actually think consensus is a good thing, okay? And luckily for us, in those situations, human beings are built for consensus. However, in the venture world, of course, it's exactly the opposite. We invest, especially in early stage, by definition something. That is, if a startup is going to be successful, the startup is going to do something that nobody else did before.
Yep.
Nobody else did before that well. It's maybe a new industry. It could be maybe a completely different solution to the existing problem. It might be a completely different problem, and so on. As a result of this, it's much easier to be negative about a venture startup. And so the moment you insist on consensus, you actually will pass on the deals that are the worst, seems like a great idea, but also the best. And you know what, in the VC world, the worst deals don't care at the end of the day. It's the best deals. And my research clearly showcases this.
Which is back to your singles and doubles don't count.
Right. So which is, as a friend of mine, Alex Rampel, who is an investor with Andreessen Horowitz, says, conviction beats consensus. And I would say, on average, every single time. Now, as a result of this, the decision-making structure is very important. So if you require that your CVC is consensus, let's say for political reasons, especially if it's at the investment committee, okay? So everybody, like the business unit, the CFO, the general counsel, the head of R&D, everybody have to be okay. You should not expect great outcomes, either financial or strategic. You just will miss all the great deals, okay?
Yeah.
Or you will say, let's invest in them, but only when everybody already knows that they're great deals, and then again, financially it's unlikely to be that great, but also strategically, likely somebody will be before you. Now, going back to M12 now. When Nicolas designed M12 in 2016, one thing he did is he introduced the anti-veto rule, which is interesting. We think about veto.
Yep.
And veto means that that one person, typically a senior person in the room, can veto. Like, if you're my boss, whatever I say, you can veto. So Nicolas said no veto, which is if the rest of the investment team or a certain number of people on the investment team wanted to do the deal, even if Nicolas thought this is like ridiculous, the deal would go ahead. So think of many companies where if the CEO really thinks it's a stupid idea, you still would go ahead. But that is the nature. That is the nature of venture. But he had the anti-veto. The only thing that he gave himself is that if everybody else thought it was a stupid idea, okay, he could still invest.
So he had the silver bullet.
He had the silver bullet, but the silver bullet in a specific direction, okay? And so that is an example of a structure. And again, I'm not saying that this structure would work for everybody. But I think if you are building a corporate venture unit, and you would like to invest in the best companies in a specific niche, or you would like to explore new domains, okay, disrupt domains, not in the core of what you do, then I think that you should try, to the extent possible, avoiding consensus. Again, it is difficult, and very often when I come and talk to senior people in the companies, not the CVC very often, but the people at the top, we spend quite a bit of time talking about why it's okay to have consensus in some of your decisions, that in fact you spend most of the time doing, and it is not okay to have consensus when you come to the investment committee. Again, it will be unnamed, but in fact there were several names here. Heads of several CVCs would tell me in our researches that we never had a rejection by the investment committee, which seems like, oh wow, which means that you don't need for, it's something like, oh wow, no need for consensus. Well, it's exactly the opposite, because then they said, I pre-socialized every single deal. So I would go to the CFO, I would go to the chief strategy officer, I would go to whoever else in the committee, okay, and I would bring only and only deals that I knew would get support.
Okay,
because
but you killed it yourself.
So therefore, right, so this is a huge adverse selection problem, okay? And as a result of that, you always miss the best. It is true, you also likely miss the worst deals, likely, okay? Because obviously the investment committee consists of extremely smart people. They can see like challenges, problems, etc. I think the investment committee members should realize, and this is something for our listeners and viewers that are not at the CVC level but at the corporate level, okay? Which is the following. You have to use your experience, your smartness, not with respect to ideally every single individual investment that your CVC is making, you have to think strategically about portfolio allocation. And in fact, I think that very often the senior corporate leaders are better positioned than the CVC people to think about portfolio allocation, because they think about broad industry aspect. They know the strengths and the weaknesses of their business units, okay? And so the strategic mandate of portfolio allocation should go typically down, maybe with the participation of CVC, because again, CVC allows you to explore what's happening in the market right now. But whenever a person inside the company who spends 99.99% of their time on solving internal day-to-day problems makes a decision on whether to make a $5 million check, and by the way, just a couple of hours ago they spent half an hour thinking about whether to make another $500 million project, okay? This is not a great idea.
Yeah. I think one of the golden nuggets is consensus makes sense when you have a high level of certainty or skills versus a lack of consensus needed, or even the anti-veto concept where you have a very high level of uncertainty.
Yes. So I think that is critical. I think uncertainty is important. I think it also depends on the type of uncertainty. So, you know, when you buy a lottery ticket, you can think it's very uncertain. But I don't think you don't need consensus here.
Yeah.
So I think you can think of kind of linear and nonlinear uncertainty.
Okay.
And when there is a lot of nonlinearities present, so that we just cannot, it's just very difficult to predict what's going to happen. So everybody talks now about generative AI. Okay? But if you go back 10 years down the road, but even 5 years down the road, smart people did not realize that it was coming.
Like and electricity.
So, in fact, like almost every technology, okay? And by the way, it not just people did not realize it was coming, but also timing is very difficult to predict, okay? So in research, we often talk about S-curves, and by the way, you know, I spend a lot of time always when I talk to corporate leaders talk about S-curves. So why S? It's the adoption of new something. People think about new technology, but actually it's new processes, new stuff. Yep. So effectively, if you think about this, it's initially nobody cares about it, okay? And of course, many new technologies, new ideas die off anyway. But then there's a point where it reaches critical mass, and then suddenly it becomes interesting. Suddenly it becomes widespread. Yep. And it's very difficult to predict when this moment happens and if this moment is going to happen, okay? So as a result of this, corporate leaders should realize is that they cannot predict the future, but in fact they don't need to predict the future. They need to design for the future, or they need to design to be able to catch the future. And building that decision-making process is one very clear-cut way.
That's a golden nugget. And actually, if you think about the mission of a CEO and their board, is to plan for the future, to make sure the company will continue to grow, do well, scale, and not be disrupted. And so within that framework, how would you advise let's say $2 billion company today, revenue per year, that doesn't have a CVC, that is working in something that has been stable for 10 years, but they are worried about disruption, but they just don't know what could be the disruption? How would you help them think about whether to have a CVC or a different type of corporate innovation or corporate venturing?
Yeah. There are many companies like that. So first of all, in whatever industry you are, if your business has been stable or traditionally unstable, like the recessions, etc., the next 10 years is going to be different. I can guarantee you. Yep. I have never seen, I'm teaching at Stanford, venture capital. It's a very popular class, not because of me, because I have hundreds and hundreds of students who became founders of venture-backed companies. I've never seen such a variation in industries that my students start their companies in, okay? Like, I cannot name an industry where they don't start a company, and that's so different from what was 10, 15, 20 years ago. Now, as a result of this, the first premise that you have to start with is whatever your industry is, whatever your geography is, the next 10 years will be much less stable. Second is how to prepare for it. And I think that if you do it correctly, the CVC is amazing. Now, you mentioned 2 billion in revenue, which I think is a very important point. Not the number, 2, but I think billion.
Yeah.
And the reason behind it is that, you know, CVC has fixed costs. And unfortunately, if you're small enough, you just can't afford it.
Yeah.
Okay, you just can't afford it. By the way, I have a potential solution for smaller companies as well. Well, if you're very, very small, for smaller companies like sub 1 billion. But if you're 1 billion and above, I think you can afford to build a CVC. Now, the very first question you have to ask is, what is your unfair advantage? This is my favorite question that I ask. And again, every single corporation, I think, with earning more than 1 billion plus, okay, I think has an unfair advantage in its product, in its niche, in its knowledge, in its geography, whatever. Yep. And then it can offer something to the best startups. And then if you're thinking about starting CVC and designing CVC, again, look at these check marks. So read the book, but also I published a piece in the MIT Sloan Management Review about pitfalls that CVC designers absolutely must avoid, okay, at any cost. Let me give you a couple of other examples. What I think questions that any company of 2 billion revenue should answer in designing CVC. One, where that CVC should be located. Because most of the companies in your description will be located way outside traditional innovation hubs. So other things equal, and again, you know, without going to your company and looking at the company, etc., and talking to your leaders, it's very difficult for me to comment, but I think that other things equal, do not position your CVC in the same building as your CEO. Position it somewhere else. Maybe it's across town, or maybe it's an innovation hub. And by the way, you know, we're right now at the Stanford campus, at the heart of Silicon Valley. I'm in fact not advertising Silicon Valley. I don't think Silicon Valley is great for all the CVCs.
Not for all industries.
No, not for all industries. So sometimes it could be Texas. Sometimes it could be New York or Los Angeles. Sometimes it could be London or Middle East, etc. But I think that you should position CVC somewhere else. Now, the moment you position somewhere else, you have to answer 2 critical questions. What is this relationship between the CVC that is somewhere else and the mothership? How you're going to communicate? How you're going to report? Okay, how you're going to make decisions? And the second critical question as well, if it's somewhere else, who is going to be there? How many people are going to be there? Okay. And I think that, again, I've seen, unfortunately, many CVC attempts that start kind of ad hoc, accidentally. And more often than not, they're not successful. But don't rush into it. Well, rush, and don't wait for 10 years. But don't rush into this by just think about first how to think through this. And again, I think what is critical is to acquire the mindset of asking yourself the right questions. So in fact, I have this checklist of questions that you have to answer. And again, I'm going to repeat. I will not be able to tell you what the correct answer is. I will be able to tell you what the wrong answer is most of the time. But there are several correct answers that depend on a number of things.
If anything, it's more about asking the right questions more than having wrong answers.
I agree with that. So it's asking the right questions and then trying just to think through the right questions. You know, all companies have strategic offsites. Okay, all companies have board directors that get together and discuss. And I do believe that that's this question, which, by the way, does not need to be just about CVC, but should be more broadly about how we survive in the next 10 years, how we can implement corporate innovation in this disruptive world. Now, CVC is only one answer. There are many other answers, but I think the CVC is a very, very powerful answer. By the way, on this note, here's my suggestion for, again, leaders of companies that listening to us now. One of my favorite exercises for corporate leaders is called pre-mortem exercise. Now, we all know about post-mortem,
yeah, we do.
Reading detective stories and watching about, whatever, all this famous Agatha Christie novels or whatever. So, what is pre-mortem? Pre-mortem is asking ourselves a very uncomfortable, unpleasant question. It's 5 years down the road, and our company failed, or our company's revenue reduced by 50%, or our company is no longer the leader in this industry. I mean, you can come up with your own kind of pessimistic outcomes, yep. Okay? What happened? This is pre-mortem exercise.
Why
okay?
did it die?
Why did it die, okay? Yeah. And by the way, I've led these pre-mortem exercises at a number of corporate workshops for, again, you can do it only for senior leaders. Like if the CEO is not in the room, this exercise does not really work that well. And I have to say, this is one of the most powerful exercises that one can do. Ideally, you need to have somebody independent, an outsider, who kind of knows a little bit about you, but kind of has no vested interest.
No judgment.
In you,
yeah.
Right? So unbiased, because at the end of the day, I'll move on. I'll care about my former students, but apart from that, kind of, okay. So you need to have somebody who can manage this process. This is very, very. So if you've never done this pre-mortem exercise, very powerful, and then after that, you can ask yourself, okay, what are the potential solutions? Okay, what are the potential solutions to prevent this? And I think very quickly, if your size is large enough, you'll come up with a corporate venture.
If anything, you talked about maybe below 1 billion, you can't afford the CVC, but it feels like once you get to $2, maybe $3 billion, you can't afford not to have a CVC.
I agree with you. However, even though corporate venture is extremely popular today, in fact, most companies, more than half of the large companies of $2+ billion, still don't have a corporate venture, okay? And of course, they're less likely to view us, okay?
I feel like we should do a bet, because I think 12 years ago there was about 400 CVCs,
right?
According to statistics and the GCV. I think now we have about 4,000, so yeah. It's a 10x in 12 years. What do you think in 10 years from now, how many CVCs?
It's a good question. I, in fact, don't think that there will be many more than 4,000.
Okay.
Okay. And the reason is not that there will not be new CVCs, but I think that many of the ones that exist now will not exist. Nicolas, so you said 10x. Yes and no. Well,
it's not the same, yeah.
So 4,000 divided by 400 is 10. Okay, I'm not going to argue here. But it's not the same. Do you know how many of these 400 CVCs no longer exist? The majority of them.
Yeah, I would imagine maybe 50 or 100
are left. The vast majority, right. And by the way, there are many companies that had a CVC, closed CVC, had a CVC, closed the CVC. And then
so I think we have a bet. I think it will be more than 20,000.
More than 20,000
yes.
CVCs in 10 years?
In 10 years.
What are we going to bet on?
Bottle of wine?
Fancy bottle of wine?
You tell me which one.
So I love French wine.
Chateau Yquem?
Chateau Yquem? Let's do Chateau Yquem.
Okay.
Chateau Yquem that is older than both of us. How about that?
Ooh, okay, we have a bet. That's the first time I bet on the Corporate Venturing Insider podcast. Now I want to move to your book, because your book really surprised me. I thought it was meant for VCs, but actually it's meant for corporations to start having the same mindset, the venture mindset, as venture capitalists. And you just talked, for example, let's talk about consensus, which you said makes sense for big corporations. But you also talked about agree to disagree. So at which point consensus should be disrupted even inside the corporations to make better decisions?
Yeah. So first of all, let me go back to your original point about the book. Indeed, we did not write it. I wrote it with a former student of mine. Indeed, we did not write it for VCs. Okay, VC is not the target audience. But the book is about how smart VCs make decisions. And the book is really for a modern decision maker who lives in a new disruptive environment. By definition, Every single corporate executive lives these days in this environment. And by the way, it's not just for corporate executive, it's a non-profit executive too, and it's a regulator too, okay? So as a result of this, the book is about people who make decisions and also make decisions on behalf of other people. So executives, leaders, okay? Now, the whole premise of the book is that, first, VCs make decisions differently, at least from most corporations. Yeah. Second, is that in the past, it was a niche industry of no interest. And that is because VCs historically invested in disruptive industries. And the world is full of disruption, but disruption typically happens in a specific industry or a specific period of time. It took longer. And nowadays, it's happening everywhere, in every single industry, in every single space, geographic space, industry space, etc. And so VCs have been facing this for 50 years. As a result of this, not just because they are smart, but because in order to survive and succeed in this hostile environment, they had to come up as a body, kind of, with new ways of making decisions. That it's really not just possible or important, but it behooves modern decision maker today to use that knowledge. So this is why we called it the venture mindset, not the venture capital mindset, the venture mindset. Mm-hmm. And this is why we wrote this book in a very non-academic style, in a very non-finance style, okay, non-investment style. Mm. And kind of, as we were writing it, I told Alex, my co-author, I said, look, here is my goal for myself. On every single page of the book, it should be easy to read, should be enjoyable, unput-downable, page turner. But every single page needs to have at least one idea that if you take this seriously, this is going to be new for you. Mm. Okay, and so if you go back to the book, okay, every single page has something, okay? Now, what is really interesting though, and by the way, you asked me earlier about what surprised me. Here's what surprised me, is that I expected that, leaders like you will love the book, that leaders like your bosses, okay, will love the book, okay. What I did not expect is VCs would love the book. Mm. But turns out is that, so many VCs have just been recently gave a keynote speech at one of the VC funds AGM. There were founders, there were LPs, etc. Mm-hmm. So they just gave the book to everybody. And there are now so many VCs that come to me and say, Ilya, can you come and help us to tell us how everybody else is making decisions in the industry? What are the best practices? Okay, so that was very interesting learning for me.
To me, it's not surprising because you picked the best VCs, their best practices, and you put them into the book for corporate leaders to read, but VCs want to learn the best practices from the best VCs.
Right.
So that one doesn't surprise me at all. So you have 9 principles. We won't have time to go through the 9, but which one do you think it would be the most contrarian to what a CEO of a big company would think in terms of decision making?
Well, first of all, luckily we already touched upon some of those topics. Okay, some of those nine principles, such as patience or impatience, such as agree to disagree. Okay, I would say every single principle is important. Truly, I'm not exaggerating. But if I had only 90 seconds to spend with the CEO of a large company in an elevator, okay, and I had his undivided attention for this 90 seconds, I would go to principle number 1, which is what we say using baseball analogy: home runs matter, strikeouts don't. Now, corporate leaders and corporations as bureaucratic structures are typically risk averse. Okay. Now, senior executives, not the CEO, but senior executives are risk averse because they know that a failure can lead to punishment.
Yep.
Now, however, if you are the CEO or the owner of a large company, okay, the failure should be maybe the best thing that had happened to you, because that means that your organization is trying something new. And the CEOs should think about their corporations especially those 2 billion plus corporations, as portfolio of bets.
That's a big concept.
That's a big concept, portfolio of bets, which is, yes, you don't want to fail in your core product that brings you all the cash. But whenever you invest in startups via CVC, or when you are doing internal innovative projects, in order to get these home runs, in order to get this outlier financial and strategic returns, you need to be able to take risk. Embracing risk is important. And if you're the CEO, that means that you may have 20 vice presidents doing different things. That's okay if several of them fail. Now, they will fail if they try. They will try if they know that not necessarily this would lead to the end of their career. Okay? And as a result of this, I think in the most successful companies, failure is not just a negative. It in fact could be very positive, very constructive. Just to give you an example of a leader that many people quote these days, Jeff Bezos. When he was heading Amazon, he would say again and again, is that the size of our failure should increase with the scale of our company.
Yep.
Okay? And by the way, not only he said that, but in fact he followed it through. Like the example we give in the book is when Amazon decided to compete with iPhone and spend, I believe, $800 million on making Fire Phone, which was a huge flop. Now, well, I will not maybe put you in an uncomfortable position about TDK, Nicolas, but okay, our listeners. So if you're in a corporation, imagine that you've just lost $800 million, or it was a non-trivial amount of money for Amazon at the time, a large number of money. What would happen to you?
Well, it's career defining in a negative sense.
So, yes, and Bezos just didn't, that CEO was, that VP or EVP was not fired. In fact, he was later put in charge of even bigger projects. Mm. And I think he will contribute to Echo, Amazon Echo, to Alexa, and so on. And here I would like to tell a story. It might be apocryphal, by the way, because there are so many stories. You never know, they're fictitious or non-fictitious, about Tom Watson, the IBM legendary CEO. Mm-hmm. When the same happened in IBM many years ago, and a senior executive lost a lot of money on a project, he was called to the CEO office. And he came with a letter of resignation because he was absolutely certain that he would be fired, okay? And Watson said, no, I've just spent $25 million on your education. And $25 million was a lot of money back then. So I'm not really sure whether that actually happened, okay? But I think that is an amazing idea. Now, it doesn't mean, by the way, that any single failure is good. So VCs would invest in founders that failed, but they would explore why those founders failed. Mm. Okay? So it's exactly the same here. It's not about failure. It's about whether the failure was kind of constructive.
Did you learn from it? One of our investment director, one of our portfolio companies ceased operation. We had invested $1 million. I asked him what did he learn and what would he do differently, and there was a lot he learned, a lot he would do differently. I say, good, that was a $1 million education.
Exactly, okay, exactly. Stanford is expensive, but I think it's still less than 1 million, I think. Maybe Stanford should increase to 1 million, okay?
Let's not give bad ideas to the dean. So what would be another principle in the book which the CEO of big corporations could use to change a mindset inside the team? So here I'm really thinking about mindset change. Because it's not sufficient just to have the CEO having venture mindset. You need this to percolate.
I agree. Well, let me talk about another principle that I really like, and that I think one principle that VCs don't need to remind you about, but large corporations do. The principle which we call in the book, get outside of four walls.
Yeah.
Now, so if you're a corporate employee, so just close your eyes, okay, and ask yourself a question. How much time you spend talking to your colleagues as opposed to anybody outside your corporation? Now, professionally, exclude your family, okay? and friends. And it turns out to be most of the time, obviously, you spend inside the four walls. And by the way, maybe for most corporate employees it's a good idea, but not for those who are in charge of innovation. By the way, it's irrelevant whether you're in CVC or not in CVC. If you're in internal innovation, you should spend more time getting outside. So a little research project we did, which I really like, we looked at the LinkedIn profiles of VCs, CVCs, and corporate executives. And yes, VCs have more LinkedIn connections than CVCs. And yes, CVCs have more connections than corporate executives. But this is less interesting. What's more interesting is that the VC profiles, the institutional VC profiles, are much more diversified. Okay? So different industries, different educational background, different ages, different geographies. While if you look at the corporate executive LinkedIn, it's mostly your company, maybe your previous company, maybe the school you went to. And I think that it's really important. The best ideas in the disruptive world very often will come outside your industry.
In a way, corporate venturing done well, whether CVC or in a different shape, is all about scouting for innovations, the ones you wouldn't know from within your four walls.
Absolutely. By the way, scouting is great. So we discussed scouting in the book as well. Again, if done correctly, okay, if done in the right way, I think it could be very powerful. But this is one of the many ways you can get outside of the four walls. But by the way, getting outside of the four walls is uncomfortable.
Very.
Very uncomfortable, okay? It's, and as a result of this, most people don't do it. But in the disruptive environment, you're likely not going to survive for long if you stay within your shell. So that is another principle. And this is the principle which, you know, I think the CEOs of companies, by their nature, are more outgoing. Mm-hmm. And they likely talk more to outsiders. But the moment we go down, this is where I think this principle really needs to get applied.
Well, Satya, the CEO of Microsoft, go and talk to so many people, customers, entrepreneurs, CEOs of startups. He wants to know what's happening outside the four walls.
Exactly, exactly. And I think if you look at a lot of CEOs who are running very successful companies, and by the way, not in a technology, we talk a lot about technology, but I would like to emphasize that it's not about technology, okay? Or very traditional companies, they really try to go outside. They really also try to make sure that their team members that are in charge of innovation, that are in charge of designing for the future, are looking outside. They talk to their customers, they talk to the potential customers, they talk to people in the adjacent industries, and maybe sometimes they talk to completely kind of strangers, because again, you never know where that disruption is effectively going to come from.
There is value in serendipity when searching for innovation.
You know, it's interesting. There is a value for serendipity, but unless you have a prepared mind, right, this serendipity will pass you. It's very important. We kind of believe in luck, and I think luck plays a very important role in life. But in real life, not when you buy a lottery ticket, but in real life, I think luck is something that happens, but most people don't take because they're not prepared for their luck.
They don't see it.
They don't see it because they're not prepared. Okay, so I think having the prepared mind is also, it's another principle in the book, but it's also very important.
Can you speak about the prepared mind? Because I think this is actually part of the upfront work that's needed to create opportunities for innovation and breakthrough.
So, well, prepared mind effectively is a deep dive into something that is happening right now, or you think that is going to happen in the future, in your industry, in a specific space. And preparing your mind might take different forms. For example, recently Jason Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, gave a talk to our students at Stanford, at the business school. And what was the most impressive, I think? And he's a very impressive
Very.
guy, okay? But what is the most impressive is the following. Look, he achieved fame, success, wealth, okay? Every single day, he still spends, I think, 2 to 3 hours studying, preparing his mind.
Yeah.
Wow. That's impressive, okay?
Very.
That's impressive. And he, I think presumably it's a closely guarded secret of what exactly he's studying right now. But think about, you identify an interesting idea, an interesting space you would like potentially to invest in. Again, within the company, outside the company, you spend a lot of effort trying to learn. Now, then it's going to be paid. It will pay back. How it is going to pay back? So let's say then you see a very interesting opportunity. How do you know that it is potentially interesting? Because you've studied the space, okay? Or you see something that looks interesting, but actually it's not interesting. Or you know that actually it's already been done, or somebody's already implementing this who is likely better. When we look at the most successful VCs, very often, they have this thesis that something is going to work eventually. Maybe a new market, a new technology solution, whatever. And they're going to bet on this. So they may lose this bet. But within this bet, they're going to typically meet every single startup.
Yep.
Because they would like to choose the best. So then I would say that when VCs have prepared mind, entrepreneurs should have prepared mind too. Okay? And here's what I hear again and again and again from smart VCs. When they meet with founders, one of the critical questions is, what did I learn from you? Because if a venture capitalist meets a founder, and after 1 hour of conversation, the founder hasn't produced anything that is new, surprising, whatever, for a VC, and in fact VC thinks that I know more about the space than the founder, that's likely the end of the relationship.
Yeah, in a way I feel like we always talk about connecting the dots, but you need to research the dots to know where they are before you connect them.
Right.
So in my last question, I want to talk about another principle, which is about the jockey. And this is one term which is so well understood in VC, which I think most corporations have no idea what it is. Can you talk about why it's so important?
Absolutely. Again, it's it's principle number 4 in the book, and I think it's another critical principle. So, first of all, what is a jockey? In the VC world, jockey is effectively human capital of the startup. It's the founders, but also it's the early employees, so it's the team. And typically, for a startup, it's a small team.
Yep.
And then there's a horse, okay? And what is the horse? Well, it's a business model, and it's a product, and it's a market, and it's go-to-market strategy. And I can continue. Now, obviously, if you don't have a horse at all, like if you have a donkey,
You won't go far.
or you cannot jump over, okay? So you need to have a horse. But this is something that is important, that every single smart VC knows, is that there are many horses in every single race. Many horses, okay? And typically, in today's world, in every single space, only a couple of horses might win. Typically, it's a big winner, a small winner, and then it doesn't matter. Now, which horse is going to win? It's not just because of luck. It's because of who is going to execute. That is critical. Therefore, smart VCs, especially early stage VCs, they will not invest unless they believe in the jockey. And in fact, what my research shows is that the founding team is by far the single most important factor in deciding whether to invest. When we go to a large corporation, so all of us have been to budget decisions or project decisions where there is like huge 100-page deck with all this full of Excel tables and sometimes prepared by consultants, etc. Okay. Are there people mentioned there?
So they are just looking at the horses.
They're looking just at the horses, okay? And in fact, what typically happens is that they will make a decision to invest, and only then they will ask, well, who's going to be in charge of that? Or actually maybe, okay, Nicolas, you're going to be in charge of that. Okay, now let's assemble the team, okay? And again, and I would like to emphasize that this, in the traditional environment of stability, that's a good decision. In the traditional environment, horse is much more important than jockey. Because at the end of the day, we just replace the jockeys, okay, and it's going to work. In today's environment, that is no longer the case. And so therefore, I think that, you know, some corporations might have interesting horses, they can't afford them. Not because they don't have resources, financial resources, or IP, etc., because they don't have people. They don't have the right set of people.
Ilya, I'm really glad we finished the interview with people, because at the end, building the future needs people, and the right people with a venture mindset. We talked about a few principles, but there are more principles in your book, so I will invite the audience to go and read the book. Thank you very much,
And make
Ilya.
sure that your CEO reads the book, and the board.
To every CEOs.
Yep.
Thank you, Ilya.
Absolutely.